Hello, Duke fans, and welcome to episode 8 of DBR Bites, our new, hopefully shorter version of the Duke Basketball Report podcast. I am your host for this episode. I am Sam Klein. We are coming to you, we're recording on Wednesday, February 8th. You may have already heard our preview of the Duke UVA basketball game that is coming up on Saturday. But on this episode, we are going to be diving into a recent article from Slam Online. It was an interview that Durham-based rapper Ninth Wonder did with Grant Hill, and I am joined by Donald Wine for this episode. Donald, hello. How are you?
I'm doing good. This is I'm glad you sent this article because this is something that had not yet hit my radar, but I'm glad you put it on my radar because it was a fascinating read.
Yeah, definitely. And let me give you just a quick synopsis of this, and then I have a couple questions for you about it. So the basic topic of the conversation, as I said, it was an interview that seems like it was transcribed mostly. I'm sure that they cut out some bits, but fairly in-depth discussion between Ninth Wonder, who is both a Durham native and somebody who's a big supporter of the Duke men's basketball team. If you follow Duke men's basketball on social media, he's frequently a
professor there now too, as well.
He's I didn't realize that he's also a professor in the school, and he's frequently sort of on campus, I guess, because he's teaching, but also he's frequently with the team, making music about the team. It seems like he knows all the guys in the program, so he's a big supporter of Duke and the Duke basketball brand. And of course, Grant Hill is somebody I don't think any Duke fans need any introduction for, but it's class of 1994, one of Duke's, 2 or 3 best players ever, depending on the way you look at that. And the conversation was really about the sort of the history of race, not as much at Duke as it is about at Duke men's basketball, and the way that race has had an impact on the perception of the Duke team, and the way that has changed from the 90s and the late 80s when Grant Hill was being recruited and then was on the team to today. And I think the biggest sort of highlight for me, the interesting thing that I am aware of, but is hard to internalize as someone like I'm 33 years old. Grant Hill was talking about how the discussion about Duke in the late 80s and the early 90s, when Duke men's basketball was really, becoming a prominent national brand. Not that Duke hadn't made Final Fours before, but now it was like Duke is in the Final Four almost every year starting in 1986. Most of the best players for Duke were white guys, going back to guys like Danny Ferry, and then on the teams that Grant played on, Christian Laettner and Bobby Hurley were more famous than Grant Hill was when he stepped onto campus. And then after Grant Hill, there's another sort of series of prominent white guys that were great players for Duke. Steve Wojciechowski, I don't think he name drops him, but Mike Dunleavy, and then all the way up to JJ Redick. That is the Duke that I grew up with. Donald, it's not exactly the Duke that you grew up with. I guess you remember the guys from the early 90s in a way that I don't. But Grant's point was that things have really changed in the last 10 years, and that the guys that are sort of most famous coming from Duke, in the end of the Coach K era, minus, I guess, like Grayson Allen, are all black guys. It's, Grant Hill was saying that, like, guys coming to college today kind of remember like Kyrie Irving being in school, and that's about as far back as their memory goes. So give me some of your like highlighted takeaways from this conversation, and maybe some of the stuff that stuck out to you about what Grant was describing.
Yeah. So I think there's 2 things, right? Like, when he talks about the Duke that, quote, we grew up with, right? When he was being recruited, and I think this is a interesting take on it, where you kind of said, hey, there's been these guys that have been, the prominent stars on the team. And if you think about it, one of the things that a lot of Duke haters love to say about Duke is that it was led by a bunch of white guys, but they would always single out one or maybe 2, right? Like, a whole national championship team in 1991 and 92, and people were like, well, it was a bunch of dudes led by, Danny Ferry or Bobby Hurley. The 2006 team had Sheldon Williams, whose name and number is in the rafters at Duke University, but everyone talks about JJ Redick. They don't really talk about Sheldon Williams the way they talk about JJ Redick. They don't talk about, even Shane Battier, Jay Williams, but they talk about Mike Dunleavy, right? Like, those are little things that they would like kind of key in on. And I think when you think about that 90s team, with Grant Hill, when he came in, there was an era of basketball where the cultural teams and the cultural phenomenons in the Black community sometimes were teams that, Duke ended up beating, right? UNLV, the Fab Five, those type of teams were, those matchups were considered good versus evil. And let me tell you, Duke was not the good team in that discussion back then. But you had these cultural phenomena, right? Before my time, you had the Harlem Globetrotters and Texas Western, like teams that, Black people could get behind and kind of, everyone, no matter who they were, latched onto them. Then you had the Showtime Lakers, you had the Bad Boys, again, Jordan Bulls, the Georgetown Hoyas, the Kobe and Shaq Lakers. Like those are type of teams where, they transcended the game in so many ways, but they also like their style, their swagger kind of endear themselves to the Black community. And you're right. I think it has been very recently that Duke has kind of flipped its, persona in a way to being that team that, the Black community can get behind. Honestly, he points out Kyrie Irving, and that's probably the start of it. Cause you're right. Like these kids who were in college, probably it kind of makes us old. They barely remember Kyrie going to Duke. They probably remember the 2015 team and just the whole swagger that they all had with Jalil Okafor and Tyus Jones and Justice Winslow. Then they probably remember, what really took it off, where it was just, everyone was talking about it, 2018, when Duke beat Kentucky by 38 points and Zion and RJ and Cam were just coming with this swagger that no one really thought could be associated with people who have DUKE on the front of their jersey. So I think that's kind of where it kind of took off. And now it's the thing to do. We go into the games, you see so many celebrities who are trying to be in Cameron just like we were. And I think that wouldn't have been the case back when Grant Hill was in school.
And you mentioned one of the teams that you mentioned there going back to the 80s was Georgetown, a school that Grant Hill had on his short list. He talks about this in the interview as well, that there were 5 schools that made his short list. 2 of them were private schools, Duke and Georgetown. And he was like, the perceptions of the basketball teams were different in the 80s, right? As you said, Duke was a lot whiter. Georgetown was a predominantly Black team led by a prominent Black coach, John Thompson, who wasn't just a good coach, but he was like a big member of the community there in DC. And so Grant talks about like how, Georgetown was a Black team, even in a even representing a school that was predominantly white. And he says, when you look at Duke and Georgetown as institutions, they're not that different, right? Similar sort of student body makeup, et cetera. But just the way that their basketball programs were run was kind of different. And, there are some famous stories about Grant Hill's recruitment to Georgetown that we don't need to get into here, but how there was, Grant was seriously considering it. He's he grew up in the Northern Virginia area. And he also mentions the other thing that I found fascinating here was that he talked about how many Washington, D.C. area guys came from Duke in the 80s into the 90s, and how Coach K really built a major pipeline of talent from there that extends all the way into today, right? Like Jeremy Roach is a big time DC high school basketball player who's playing at Duke. So one of Grant's takeaways was how much folks in DC really love Duke, which is sort of funny for me growing up there at the height of of Maryland basketball, when the big rivalry, Georgetown had sort of faded at that point, and the big rivalry was Duke versus Maryland. Georgetown, had, I think, a little bit of a resurgence under John Thompson III. They made one Final Four there, but not like Georgetown was in the 80s and the early 90s.
Yeah, and it's funny that, that pipeline still continues. I think it was Jared McClain is coming next year from Virginia, Northern Virginia. Yeah, Trevor Keels last year, who obviously was Jeremy Roach's teammate both at Duke and in high school. That pipeline continues, and it's interesting. It's not necessarily that people actively support Duke up here, and I know this as well as I do, but it's that, oh yeah, you're going to Duke, okay, yeah, that's what's up. It's one of those type of deals, and it's one of those where Coach K, I think Coach K, being the coach of Team USA and kind of getting that street cred in the NBA, where your favorite player's favorite player is saying, "Yo, Coach K is the real deal." I think that helped. And again, I think some of those those players that people didn't think were quote Duke material, there's a lot you can kind of read into when someone says, "Hey, someone's not Duke material." But when Zion committed here, I mean, RJ and Cam Reddish are one thing, but when Zion committed here, everyone was like, "Oh man, the mixtape king is going to Duke," and then he became otherworldly Zion here at Duke. I think that helped a lot as well. It's just those guys that those guys that people were thinking again back in the 90s they would have gone to a Georgetown, they would have gone to a Temple. Those type of players ended up being recruited by Coach K and coming to Duke, and people kind of opened their eyes and said, "Hey, these guys out here, like I would be rooting for them in any school. Like this is a team that I can get behind." And you never know when these cultural phenomena kind of come about, but Duke being a part of that conversation now is something that I didn't think would ever happen, especially given even the makeup of the team and just how it was discussed when I was in school, and that doesn't seem so long ago.
I also appreciated their discussion of the music in the locker room, because it's one, Grant Hill talks about how like there was music that was on campus, like the music that I don't know if Shooters was around, but like the music that I'm sure that you would have heard,
Alpine, the Alpine Atrium,
yeah, exactly, or blasting out of dorm rooms on West Campus. He said that there was a slightly different set of music that was coming from West Campus than the music that was coming out of the locker room in Cameron Indoor. And he said like Christian Laettner was a big hip hop fan even when he was 18 years old. So I'm reconciling in my mind the images that I have of Christian Laettner and the Christian Laettner that is a 19-year-old listening to Wu-Tang.
See, this is where they shouldn't have cut the interview, right? They shouldn't have cut this part out, because I
need more.
Grant, I need to know, was Christian Laettner, bumping Public Enemy, like NWA, Ghetto Boys? Like, how deep are we going? I know Tribe was the big deal. He talked about Tribe a lot. Tribe is one of my favorite, groups of all time. But like, was he? I mean, he was a little bit before Wu-Tang, but like, was he bumping that type of rap? Like, I need to know. We need to know how much swagger was left on the cutting room floor about Christian Laettner.
What was Christian Laettner wearing off the court? I need to know all of it.
Yeah. We need to know the style. We need to know the swag. We need more of this. So
this is the moment when I ask for audience input. So if you were on campus with Christian Laettner and you can describe his swagger to us, dbrpodcast@gmail.com.
Yes, and for Ninth Wonder, if you're listening, dbrpodcast@gmail.com. You can email us the full interview, the raw and cut, not like the ones that we get over the summer. I need the raw, so that the unpolished gem of this interview, so that we can decipher all of it in its entirety.
Donald, anything else from this that you wanted to highlight, or should we just leave the link for the listeners in the notes and let them see for themselves?
I think one thing that is important that's not in this article that kind of I could understand they were kind of referring to was the town gown relations, right? And we always, as Duke fans and Duke students, we've talked about that for generations, the relationship between Duke University and Durham, North Carolina, and Durham County, by extension. And I think, when I was in school, it was terrible. The town gown relations weren't there. It's obviously been a lot better. But it can't, it can always improve. The relationship that Duke has with the city of Durham has grown in so many ways over the years. But I think where it has always been constant is that the Duke basketball team has always been active in the Durham community, and specifically the Black community in Durham. And I think that is why, when you talk about, the Duke and North Carolina battle, everything like that, a lot of people in Durham still latch on to the Duke basketball team because of that. They had the barbershop, and I don't think it's there anymore. It's probably moved since then. But there was a barbershop that I went to that Duke and UNC basketball players would come, and that was kind of the safe space where they could, talk about life and have the, debates that we have in barbershops all around the country. But they were also in the communities. They were in, the Black night spots, like the nightclub spots. They were volunteering at these schools. These kids knew who they were. And I think it's important to remember that a lot of that ties into the community. When you see somebody on TV, the LeBron, we talk, on Wednesday, LeBron just broke the scoring record. What makes LeBron a cultural phenomenon is not just the fact that he has scored more points than anyone else in NBA history. It's the fact that off the community or off the court, he's been active in whatever community he's lived in, to the point where even still in Akron, Ohio, he has a school that bears his name, and that he is, promoting, trying to uplift those communities. And I think that's where, Duke basketball and even Duke football now has done this, but that has grown over the years. But those town gown relations have really been at the heart of what Duke is all about. And the basketball team and also the football team and even the women's basketball team have been the main extension, the main cultural olive branch to the Durham community. And I think that's important.
Grant Hill's probably also understating the impact that he personally has had
absolutely
in the Black community in Durham, as one of the most prominent sort of faces of Duke University, but also someone who gets a lot from giving back. So he didn't talk about it extensively in this piece, but
it's always there, right? He's always definitely in Durham. Like, it feels like the fact that he's the part owner of the Atlanta Hawks is like an afterthought to what all the stuff that he does in the DC community, where he grew up here, in Durham, and everywhere else, even in Detroit, he still has hands in the community, and he played there, over 25 years ago. So, he definitely understated a lot of what he brings to the table, with regards to, helping out in the community.
So, as we mentioned, we'll link to this article. You may have seen it posted by Duke men's basketball a few days ago when it came out, but take a look at that interesting read, and we hope that you enjoy it. We will be back very soon to talk more actual live Duke basketball. So stick around. This has been episode 8 of DBR Bites. For Donald Wine, I'm Sam Klein. We'll talk to you again soon. Duke Band, take us home.